There's a place in Brazil where the earth turns to powder, where rivers disappear for years at a time, where trees shed every last leaf and stand like skeletons against a white sky, and where the sun beats down with a kind of fury that feels almost personal. This place is called the Sertão, a vast semi-arid region in the northeastern interior of Brazil that stretches across 9 states and covers an area larger than the entire state of Texas. For centuries, the people who lived there built their lives around one unavoidable truth. The rain would come, and then it would stop. And when it stopped, everything changed. The droughts of the Brazilian Sertão are not like anything most people in the modern world have ever experienced. They are not inconveniences. They are not temporary setbacks. They are slow, grinding, relentless catastrophes that last not for weeks or months, but for years, sometimes stretching across entire decades. The most devastating drought in recorded Brazilian history lasted from 1877 to 1879. And by the time it was over, historians estimate that somewhere between 150,000 and 500,000 people had died. Not from a single dramatic event, but from the slow collapse of everything that kept human beings alive. The water, the food, the animals, the soil, all of it gone. And yet, the people of the Sertão did not disappear. They adapted. They survived. And the way they survived, the things they learned to eat, the techniques they developed, the wisdom they passed down from generation to generation, tells one of the most extraordinary stories of human resilience ever recorded. To understand what survival in the Sertão actually looked like, you have to first understand the landscape itself. The Caatinga biome, the name comes from an indigenous Tupi word meaning white forest, is the only exclusively Brazilian biome on Earth. It covers more than 800,000 square kilometers and is home to an astonishing array of plant and animal life, much of it found nowhere else on the planet. But during a drought, the Caatinga becomes a gauntlet. The rivers, called rios intermitentes, or intermittent rivers, simply stop flowing. The reservoirs that families depend on shrink to muddy puddles and then vanish entirely. The soil cracks open in wide, geometric patterns, like the surface of a dried-out painting. The temperature regularly exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. And the food? The crops, the animals, the fruit, it disappears along with the water. For the people who lived through the great droughts, hunger was not an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, a companion that followed you from morning to night and invaded your dreams. But hunger also taught people to look at their environment differently, to see potential nourishment in places they had never thought to look before. And what they found, and what they learned to do with it, would become one of the most extraordinary bodies of practical knowledge in Brazilian history. One of the first things people learned was that the Caatinga itself, as barren as it appeared, was full of things that could keep a person alive, if you knew how to find them, how to prepare them, and how to make them last. The mandacaru cactus, which stands tall and branching across the Sertão like a sentinel, became one of the most important survival plants in the region. During droughts, cattle farmers had long known to burn the spines off the mandacaru and feed the soft inner pulp to their animals, keeping herds alive when there was nothing else to eat. But the people themselves also learned to consume the cactus, boiling the inner flesh into a soft, almost tasteless paste that provided hydration as much as nutrition. The mandacaru held water inside its thick trunk, and in a land where water was the difference between life and death, that capacity was worth more than gold. The Zique cactus, another species native to the Caatinga, was similarly vital. Smaller and more densely spined than the mandacaru, the Zique grew in clusters across the rocky terrain and produced a fruit that, while not particularly flavorful, was edible and provided calories when nothing else was available. The seeds of various cacti were dried and ground into rough flours. The flowers were eaten raw or boiled. Every part of the plant that could be consumed was consumed and nothing was wasted, but cacti were only the beginning. The people of the Sertão also turned to tree barks, roots, and leaves that under normal circumstances would never have appeared in anyone's kitchen. The huazeiro tree, a hardy, drought-resistant species that somehow managed to stay green even in the harshest conditions, which is why it became a sacred tree in the culture of the Sertão, produced small, olive-like fruits that were slightly sweet and nutritious. During droughts, these fruits became a critical food source, and entire families would camp beneath huazeiro trees, eating the fruit fresh or drying it in the sun to preserve it for later. The dried fruit could be ground into a kind of flour and mixed with water to make a thick paste that sustained people for days. There are accounts from the late 19th century of families surviving for weeks on almost nothing but juazeiro fruit and whatever scraps of water they could collect from rocky crevices after the rare, brief rains. The umbu tree, called the tree of life by many Sertanejo people, was perhaps the most important plant of all during times of drought. The umbu is a remarkable organism. Its root system spreads out horizontally across a vast area just below the surface of the soil. And within those roots, it stores enormous quantities of water and nutrients in swollen, tuber-like structures called xylopodios. A single mature umbu tree can hold hundreds of liters of water in its root system, and during droughts, people learn to dig carefully around the base of the tree to access these underground reservoirs. The umbu fruit itself, small, round, greenish-yellow, and intensely tart, was eaten fresh, dried, fermented into a kind of rough wine, or cooked into thick preserves that could be stored for months. Every part of the plant was used. The leaves were eaten. The roots were scraped for moisture. The tree gave everything it had, and the people of the Sertão understood its value in a way that bordered on reverence. Beyond plants, the people of the Sertão developed extraordinary techniques for hunting and trapping the animals that remained in the caatinga during droughts. The mocó, a small rabbit-like rodent native to the region, became one of the most important protein sources available. Quick, secretive, and adapted to live in rocky outcroppings, the mocó was difficult to catch, but not impossible. Hunters developed elaborate stone traps and pit systems, carefully positioned along the routes the animals used to reach water. A single mocó might provide enough meat to feed a small family for a day, and during long droughts, families became extraordinarily skilled at processing and preserving whatever meat they caught. Meat was dried in thin strips under the brutal Sertão sun, a technique called carne de sol, or sun-dried meat, or rubbed with coarse salt and hung in the dry air, sometimes lasting for weeks without spoiling. Lizards, particularly the teiu, a large, impressive reptile that could reach nearly a meter in length, were another crucial food source. The teiu was abundant in the caatinga, and while it required skill and patience to catch, provided a substantial amount of meat. The technique for preparing teiu varied by region and family, but the most common method was to roast the entire animal over an open fire, then pull the meat from the bones and mix it with whatever else was available. Dried beans, flour, cooked roots. Nothing was discarded. The organs were eaten. The fat was rendered and used for cooking other things. Even the bones were boiled into a thin broth that provided some nutrition and, crucially, hydration. Armadillos were similarly prized. The tattoo, as it is called in the northeast, was hunted with sticks and snares, and its meat, which has a taste somewhat similar to pork, was considered one of the better food sources available during hard times. Armadillo fat was also used medicinally, rubbed on skin cracked by the dry heat, or applied to the chests of children with respiratory problems. The practical and the culinary overlapped constantly in Sertão survival culture. Food was also medicine, and medicine was often food. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sertão survival cooking was what people did with the parts of animals that, in times of abundance, would have been discarded. During ordinary years, the wealthier families in the region ate the better cuts of pork, beef, and goat, and the poor made do with what was left. But during droughts, even those distinctions collapsed. Everything that could be eaten was eaten. The ears, snout, and trotters of pigs were slow cooked for hours in clay pots with whatever spices and aromatics were available: dried peppers, wild herbs, the occasional handful of salt. The intestines of goats were cleaned and stuffed with minced offal, then grilled over coals. The feet of cattle were split and boiled into a gelatinous broth that was thick with collagen and surprisingly sustaining. Heads were roasted whole in clay ovens dug into the earth, a technique that preserved moisture and transformed even the toughest, most collagen-rich tissues into something tender and nourishing. This cooking of the so-called fifth quarter, the parts of the animal that polite society preferred not to acknowledge, became not just a matter of survival, but a genuine culinary tradition. The dishes that emerged from necessity became beloved regional foods, passed down through generations long after the immediate crisis had passed. Sarapatels, a thick, spiced stew made from pig's blood, heart, liver, and lungs, is today considered a delicacy across the Northeast, served at festivals and family gatherings, a dish that carries within it the memory of every drought that ever forced a family to use every last part of the animal they had. Buchada de bode, goat stomach stuffed with the animal's own organs, tied shut and cooked slowly in its own juices, is another dish with deep roots in survival necessity that became a point of regional pride. These foods were born from desperation and transformed over generations into identity. Water, of course, was the most fundamental challenge of all. In the Sertão, water management during droughts was a matter of life and death, and the techniques people developed to find, collect, and preserve water were as sophisticated as anything you would find in a formal engineering curriculum. The cacimbas, hand-dug wells sunk into the dry beds of rivers and streams, were perhaps the most widespread technique. When a river stopped flowing on the surface, it did not immediately mean that all the water was gone. Moisture often remained trapped in the sandy substrate of the riverbed, just below the surface, and a person who knew where to dig and how deep to go could sometimes find enough water to survive another day. Families dug cacimbas by hand, sometimes going down 2 or 3 meters in the suffocating heat, and then drew water up in clay pots or gourds, a few liters at a time. Rainwater collection systems, built from stone, clay, and whatever other materials were available, were another critical technology. The cisternas, large underground reservoirs lined with clay or stone, were designed to capture every drop of rain that fell on a roof or carefully shaped catchment area during the rainy season, storing it underground where evaporation could not reach it. A well-built cisterna could hold enough water to sustain a family through months of drought. The families that had them were the ones most likely to survive. Those without them were forced to travel, sometimes walking dozens of kilometers, to reach the nearest asud, or reservoir. And even those were often nearly empty by the middle of a long drought. The way food was preserved was equally sophisticated. In a region where there was no refrigeration, no electricity, and often very little salt available, keeping food from spoiling in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius required ingenuity. Fruits were dried on flat stones or clay tiles under the direct sun, concentrating their sugars and reducing their moisture to the point where bacterial growth was impossible. Meat was salted heavily and hung in the dry air, or buried in salt and clay pots that were then sealed with clay or animal fat. Beans and grains were stored in sealed clay containers, sometimes buried in the earth where temperatures were somewhat lower. Fermentation, which had the dual advantage of preserving food and sometimes making it more nutritious, was used extensively. Fermented cassava products, fermented fruit drinks, and even fermented animal fats appear repeatedly in historical accounts of drought survival in the region. The cassava plant, mandioca in Portuguese, deserves particular attention in any account of Sertão survival. Cassava is one of the most drought-tolerant crops on Earth, capable of surviving months without rain and then resuming growth when moisture returns. Its starchy tuber can be left in the ground for up to 3 years after it matures, effectively turning the earth itself into a storage facility. During droughts, cassava was often the last crop standing when everything else had failed, and the techniques for processing it, removing the toxic hydrogen cyanide naturally present in bitter cassava varieties through grating, pressing, and heating, were refined over generations into a sophisticated food science. Farinha de mandioca, the coarse cassava flour that is a staple of Brazilian northeastern cooking to this day, was produced in improvised wooden presses and dried in clay ovens, and it could be stored for months without spoiling. Mixed with water, dried meat, or whatever else was available, farinha was the foundation of survival eating in the Sertão. What makes all of this particularly remarkable is the social dimension of survival, the way communities organize themselves during times of extreme scarcity to maximize collective chances of living through the crisis. Food sharing in the Sertão culture was not merely a matter of generosity. It was understood as a moral obligation and a practical necessity. A family that hoarded food while its neighbors starved was not just acting badly. It was weakening the entire community's capacity to survive. The traditions of communal cooking, communal water collection, and communal labor that developed in the Sertão over centuries were direct responses to the reality of drought, a recognition that no individual or family could survive alone, against the forces that the dry season unleashed. The rezadeiros and rezaderas, the prayer, healers who occupied a central place in Sertão spiritual life, also played a practical role during droughts, serving as knowledge repositories and community organizers. They knew which plants were edible and which were toxic. They knew the locations of hidden water sources and the signs in the landscape that indicated subsurface moisture. They knew the traditional techniques for preserving food and treating the illness that came with malnutrition. Their knowledge was not merely spiritual, but intensely practical, accumulated over lifetimes of observation and passed down through oral tradition across generations. The droughts of the 20th century brought new dimensions to the survival challenge. The Great Drought of 1932, known as a Grande Seca, the Great Drought lasted 3 years and drove hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, creating one of the largest internal migrations in Brazilian history. The retirantes, as the drought refugees were called, walked hundreds of miles toward the coast in search of food and water, carrying whatever they could on their backs or in ox-drawn carts. Many never made it. Those who did found themselves in cities utterly unprepared for their arrival, and the shanty towns that grew up on the edges of Fortaleza, Recife, and other coastal cities were born directly from the desperation of the drought. But even in those desperate migrations, the food knowledge of the Sertão traveled with the people who carried it, the techniques for drying meat, for processing cassava, for identifying edible wild plants, for making something from almost nothing. The drought of 1979 to 1983, another devastating multi-year crisis, coincided with the beginnings of large-scale government intervention in the region, and the contrasts it revealed between the official response and the actual survival strategies of ordinary people were stark and instructive. Government food distribution programs provided basic staples: beans, rice, dried meat, farinha. But the people of the Sertão supplemented these rations with the same wild foods, the same animal offal, the same root processing techniques that their grandparents and great-grandparents had relied upon. The knowledge had never been lost. It had simply been waiting. There is something deeply humbling about the food culture of the Brazilian Sertão. In a world where most people's relationship with food involves supermarkets, refrigeration, and the comfortable assumption that something will always be available, the knowledge accumulated by the people of the Sertão over centuries of drought and survival represents a radically different understanding of what eating means and what food can be. Every dish that emerged from those hard times carries within it a kind of encoded wisdom, a record of the precise combination of necessity, creativity, and endurance that allowed human beings to persist in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The ears and snout of the pig, slow cooked until tender. The tart umbu fruit, dried in the sun and ground into flour. The mandacaru cactus, burned and boiled into a hydrating paste. The teyu lizard, roasted over coals and shared among a family of 7. These were not failures of taste or imagination. They were triumphs of human adaptability. Proof that the will to survive is one of the most creative forces in human history. The rains always came back, eventually. The rivers filled again. The caatinga turned green almost overnight, with a speed and exuberance that seemed almost theatrical after the long months of gray and brown. The cattle grew fat again. The crops came in. The children who had survived on cactus paste and dried lizard meat grew up and told their own children what the drought had been like, and what you ate when there was nothing left to eat, and how you kept going when everything around you had stopped. That knowledge was the most important thing the Sertão ever produced. More valuable than any crop, more durable than any house, more nourishing, in its own way, than any meal. It was the understanding, passed from hand to hand and mouth to mouth across generations, that human beings are capable of surviving almost anything, if they know how to look at the world around them and see, even in the most barren and inhospitable landscape, the possibility of life.